Not every piece of classical liberal scholarship has to be cram-jam full of allusions to Adam Smith or references to Hayek, especially in history. History is, in a way, the most humane of the humane studies. We don't write history because we know the absolute truth of what happened in the past. We don't, we can't, we probably never will, perhaps it's completely impossible. We write history first and foremost to practice empathy. It lets us do what little we can to mentally exercise in someone else's head. Plenty of historians lose touch with this fact, though, and they tell the stories of massive, impersonal, disembodied social forces. But classical liberals write their histories as the stories of individuals and their actions. Today we have historian Richard Bell, who recently spoke at one of our research workshops on his latest book, The Gut-Wrenchingly Empathetic Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. So, Professor Bell, your latest book tackles a phenomenon that I think, even though many people have heard of it, they might not know that it was an actual thing, like a proper phenomenon, the reverse Underground Railroad. So what can you tell us about that term? What does it refer to exactly?
So the best way into something like this might be through something that I bet many of your listeners are familiar with, which is what happened to a man called Solomon Northup. He is the author of a memoir called 12 Years a Slave, and that memoir was made into a Hollywood film in about 2013. And it won the Academy Award for Best Picture. It's a wonderful piece of cinema. And it tells the story of what happened to him as one individual forced passenger on what I call the reverse Underground Railroad. This is a free black man. He was in his mid-30s. He was a prosperous musician. He lived in upstate New York. And one day in 1841, he is lured into Manhattan, where he is wined and dined by 2 well-dressed white confidence men who eventually drug him and are able to kidnap him and sell him to a legal slave trader, passing him off as a slave in so doing, and transport him to New Orleans, where he is indeed sold as a slave to a sugarcane planter setting up down there in the deep South. And as you know from the title of that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, it took this free black man 12 years to escape that captivity. Remember, he's legally free. He's kidnapped and trafficked into slavery. And the research in my new book, Stolen, is designed to contextualize that case and reveal that, in fact, what happened to Solomon Northup happened thousands and thousands and thousands of times to free black adults and children, most especially, living between the American Revolution and the Civil War. So the kidnapping and human trafficking into slavery was a remarkably frequent and pernicious phenomenon, and I dub it the reverse Underground Railroad.
And your book specifically follows the story of 5 black children in Philadelphia who are captured and trafficked on this Underground Railroad. And before we talk more about the boys themselves and their situation, I'm wondering what sorts of institutions held this black market together, and to what degree was this a very organized phenomenon?
So it was protected by the legal culture of the slave South. This kidnapping network exists to exploit what by the early 19th century become major differences in the legal status of slavery in most northern states and in all the southern states. It exists in part because of the indifference of many people in positions of political or legal or judicial power, both in northern free states like Pennsylvania, where so many free black adults and children were kidnapped from, and authorities there do precious little, typically speaking, to intervene or rescue kidnapped free people who disappear from their states. And also, of course, by the legal and political culture of the slave South. There are anti-kidnapping laws in all these states, both North and South, but for the most part, and for most people, they go wholly unenforced.
Now, to me at least, this is not so much a thesis-driven book as a story-driven book. It's narrative-driven. It's about doing your very best as a historian and as a reader to occupy the lived experience of these kids as they get trafficked on the Underground Railroad. And that makes for some really, really compelling descriptions of life in Philadelphia and in New Jersey. I thought that was also very compelling about the kids escaping slavery from New Jersey and ending up in Philadelphia, and then almost immediately or relatively quickly being scooped up by this reverse Underground Railroad. Tell us a bit about the lives of African Americans in Philadelphia, and especially how did class and race intersect to sort of continue putting free people in this precarious position?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. And yes, you're right to identify this book as something perhaps unusual. It's certainly very different to my first book, which is a thesis-driven, argument-driven piece of intellectual and cultural history about a very different topic. This new book is what I call a micro-history or an embedded narrative, which means it is narrative-driven, it is character-driven, it's plot-driven. There's a beginning and a middle and an end and a story that I hope readers will want to follow and find out what happens to these boys. It's a true story, to be clear, but it is a narrative-driven attempt at writing history. So that creates various different opportunities and also challenges as a writer and as an academic. But to answer your question, yes, one of the places that I wanted to reconstruct as a world for readers was the world of early 19th century Philadelphia in the 1820s. And the case I'm writing about in this book, Stolen, follows 5 free black boys who were kidnapped from the streets of Philadelphia in late August 1825. Philadelphia in that year is home to one of the largest and certainly the most vibrant and dynamic free black community anywhere in the United States. The census tells us the population of black people in Philadelphia was about 12,000, a very large number by the standards of the day. And Philadelphia is in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has, by 1825, effectively abolished slavery. And Philadelphia is considered effectively a free city, a refuge, a place of sanctuary for lawfully free black people who want to continue to live their lives in liberty, and of course for runaways from slavery, whether they're running away from slavery in Virginia or in Maryland or in Delaware or even in New Jersey, which is next door and where there is still some agricultural slavery in the 1820s. So Philadelphia has a vibrant, dynamic free black community. It's the center of the free black church movement. For instance, the mother church of many African-American religious life is in Philadelphia. Mother Bethel, Richard Allen, the most famous black preacher of the day, is a Philadelphian. There are black mutual aid societies, there are black charities, there are black schools. This is a place where free black people believe they can be safest, most prosperous, and seize what opportunities they can. But on the other hand, Philadelphia is at the same time a deeply racially segregated place, and a place where racial tensions are just below the surface, if not out in the open in every interaction. The much larger white population competes with this embattled black population for everything, for jobs, for good housing. And free black people, while they enjoy the legal protections their liberty supposedly brings them, have to really struggle to find jobs, to find a place to sleep, to find a place for their children to go to school. And anytime the economy begins to contract, tensions between the white population and the free black population flare up, often into open violence. So for all its vaunted freedoms, and Philadelphia has the reputation of being the city of brotherly love, as being a refuge for free black people, and for being the hub of America's anti-slavery movement in this period, it is simultaneously one of the most dangerous places in the United States to be free and black. When kidnappers cross into Pennsylvania and come into Philadelphia from neighboring slave states, hoping to grab some free people and spirit them away, there are precious few white Philadelphians who are willing to lift a finger to stop them. So it's a very dangerous place to be free and black.
What kinds of methods, though, did African Americans and the abolitionist movement, and even just in some cases, onlookers with a sense of justice who see somebody clearly being kidnapped and they intervene? What kinds of methods did people employ to resist these kidnapping practices?
So, as your question points out, there were, of course, energetic, passionate efforts to resist kidnapping from members of the free black community who found themselves being targeted or saw some other member of their community being targeted by kidnappers. And it is also true that there were some white bystanders and there were some white anti-slavery activists, though the numbers were small, who certainly did get off the sidelines when confronted with an abduction in progress. And we know from the surviving sources, which get reported in newspapers, by the way, they turn up in anti-slavery organization records, by the way. We know that people would bite and kick to avoid, to make the kidnapper let them go. We know that people would yell and howl and scream to try to create witnesses and bystanders and to encourage intervention, like screaming fire in a theater, right, to get people to do something. And we know that sometimes neighbors would rush out and try to separate a kidnapper from his or her victim, that they would beat them with brickbats and clubs. They would set upon them if they could. But we also know that more often than not, these efforts were too little and too late, and vastly more people were spirited away by kidnappers than kidnappings were ever thwarted by various bystanders, onlookers, activists, etc. This was a thriving black market business in the early 19th century. And my 6 years of research suggests to me that the number of free black children and adults who are kidnapped from free cities and states in the first 50 or so years of the 19th century probably numbers in the tens of thousands. This was big business.
That is a pretty shocking figure. I mean, that's many boatloads worth of slaves, in a time when, of course, the importation of slaves from Africa was illegal and vigorously prosecuted across the world. And, this one of the interesting pieces of resistance that I found too was the way that the black community just acculturated itself toward looking for the signs of a kidnapper or a kidnapping. The sort of the rumor mill or the advice mill of how to spot it in progress, how to avoid it. It really struck me as very similar in this racist culture or the slave culture of the 19th century. It struck me as very similar to what folks in the academic left would refer to as the rape culture today, that women are simply instructed on how to avoid this sort of natural catastrophe. It is going to happen. You have to watch out for it. You have to be on your guard. Yes, you're a victim if this happens to you, but you also have to be responsible for making sure it doesn't happen.
So okay, I'm not going to touch the rape culture part of your question, but I am going to engage with the substance of the history question here, which I think is a really important one. And you're right, of course. Free black families realize that when it comes to protecting themselves and their loved ones from the threat that kidnappers pose, even in free cities like Philadelphia, that they cannot expect much outside help, much governmental intervention. Most constables, most mayors, most magistrates in places like Philadelphia are not committed anti-slavery activists in the 1820s. The free black community is almost on its own. So families themselves form the first line of defense here. And we see time and again in surviving records that free black parents are telling each other to carry their freedom papers everywhere, to make sure they remain up to date. And they're telling their children every night, probably at bedtime and again over breakfast the next day, that when you are out and about without us, when you are on your way to school or on your way to your job, and many children did have jobs in this period, that you need to be on the lookout for kidnappers, catchers, people who could grab you. You need to be able to read body language, to size up a stranger, to stay out of parts of town, to never go anywhere unaccompanied. And much of this advice to free Black children from their parents is, of course, directed around the figure of the white kidnapper and white slave catcher, who are most prominent here. But one thing my research turned up was these gangs of white kidnappers would occasionally succeed in hiring Black or mixed race operatives to do some of that front end work, trying to make an end run around free Black parents' warnings to their children to be on the lookout for suspicious white dudes. Because occasionally these suspicious white dudes would hire Black or mixed race individuals, pay them a large amount of money, enough to swallow their scruples and silence their conscience. And it would be those small numbers of Black and mixed race individuals who would actually be the decoys, be the lures, be the bait. They would sidle up to street kids who looked hungry, often kids down by the docks who were clearly looking for jobs. And they'd say something like, hey, I've got some crates of peaches and watermelons down in this ship just around the corner. I really need your help unloading them. You can trust me, and the money is good. I'll pay you 25 cents. It's enough for a nice lunch afterwards. The work will take less than an hour. Won't you walk with me this way? And unfortunately, 4 of the 5 boys who are at the center of my new book, Stolen, agree to walk with them. And that's how they end up on the ship. And the 5th resists, and a gag is stuffed across his mouth, and he is dragged to join the others.
And then these boys get trafficked by one of these gangs that you just identified. And this particular gang seemed to be centered around this just bizarre figure, a woman named Patty Cannon. So tell us about this trafficking operation on the reverse Underground Railroad and this sort of matron in charge of it, Patty Cannon.
Yes, extraordinary figure is a bizarre figure is a good way to put it. And just to answer your question, I'll come at it from a strange direction. I'll just tell you how I came across this story of these 5 boys. And it was through this woman, Patty Cannon. Well, I was writing a book about suicide in American history 10 years ago or so. And in 2011, as I was finishing that book and putting it to bed, I came across the alleged suicide of a woman out in rural Delaware in 1829, a woman whose name was Patty Cannon. I'd never heard of her before. And the situation surrounding her death was that she had rented out some fields to a tenant farmer, and one day the tenant farmer had dug up by accident some human remains on Patty Cannon's property. There was an investigation, and the claim was that they were 3 people who'd been murdered, and that Patty Cannon, the owner of the property, was the alleged murderer. And so she was holed up in jail in Georgetown, Delaware, awaiting trial on suspicion of murder. And while she was in jail, she allegedly committed suicide to avoid a trial, to escape the hangman, etc. Parts of that story fell apart upon closer inspection as I dug into it. But I also dug into this woman's life, and I discovered that prior to 1829, her career had been spent as the co-leader of America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers and child snatchers. This was a family operation where most of the operatives in the gang, the white operatives at least, were either related to each other by blood or by marriage. And she worked closely with her own son-in-law, whose name was Joseph Johnson. And between the 2 of them, over the course of about 10 years throughout the 1820s, they orchestrate and authorize one kidnapping raid on Philadelphia after another, including the kidnapping raid in August 1825, which sees 5 free Black children whose names are Joe, Enos, Sam, Alex, and Cornelius, lured into the belly of a little ship down by the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. And that ship will eventually relocate them, the boys, to a warehouse and safe house controlled by Patty Cannon. in Delaware or near the line with Maryland. They'll be incarcerated there a week, and then they'll get onto another ship which will cross the Chesapeake Bay, and members of the gang run by Patty Cannon and her son-in-law, will then march these 5 boys and two black women who are also being trafficked across the country, across the continent, from Virginia through Tennessee, through Alabama, through Mississippi, with the intention of trying to pass them off as legally purchased slaves and sell them at a great profit to new planters setting up on cotton and sugar plantations in the new territories and states rising up along the Gulf Coast in the early 19th century.
So would people caught up in one of these black market coffles, would they be integrated into the white market of the Southern slave trade at some point, or would people purchasing them have any real way of knowing that these were free people from the North? Was it like an open secret? Everybody knew that that's basically how this worked once they were there, inspecting their purchases, or was it something that planters conveniently ignored and just didn't ask the right questions, or did they see this as sort of a threat to the legal slavery regime?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And the answer is both and yes. So let me just unpack that a little bit. You go back to Solomon Northup's account in 12 Years a Slave. What happens to him after he's kidnapped is he is sold to someone who regards himself as a legal interstate slave trader, but is willing to buy a kidnapped free person for a knockdown price from people who are deeply dodgy, deeply shady. But then his job is to basically launder this kidnapped person and integrate him into the larger legal supply chain of legally bought slaves, so that by the time Solomon Northup makes it to a New Orleans slave mart, he has paperwork which says he's legitimately purchased. He has a fake bill of sale. And that while Solomon Northup can protest loudly that he is actually free and from upstate New York, the paperwork says otherwise. So that's one way to sort of launder a kidnapped free person into the legal supply chain, which is what happens to Northup and many other victims of this reverse Underground Railroad. But the other passage is more blatant. The other passage, which is what happens to these 5 boys in my book, is that they are escorted by kidnappers all the way down until they do meet buyers in the American South, in the Cotton Kingdom, in the Deep South, in Mississippi, Alabama. And it's very unlikely that kidnappers and the children themselves, I'll start that again. It's very unlikely that the people buying someone from a kidnapper did not know that that was happening. The boys in my story certainly raise hell about who they are, how they've been treated, and certainly any forged bills of sale look pretty dodgy. So all of this is to say that most buyers of kidnapped free people probably did know, either explicitly or in their heart of hearts, that they were buying someone they shouldn't. So why did they do that? The simple answer is they got a great deal. If kidnappers know that planters are well aware they're buying trafficked people, they cut the price. They offer a big discount, and eventually someone shakes their hand and says, yes, I will buy this person. A person whose demographics might suggest that in the regular slave market they would go for $500 is being offered to them for $200 and $250. For hard-up planters desperate for more black labor but lacking enough capital to acquire it through legal means, the reverse Underground Railroad fills a grotesque but important labor need, and there are plenty of planters willing to shake that person's hand and make a deal.
What happened to the boys in the end?
There are things I'm not going to tell you because I hope that folks will take a look at the book. And the book is brand new. It's been out a couple of weeks. So I hope people will take a look. But what I will tell you is the full title of the book gives a few clues. The full title of the book is Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. So what I mean by that is that while it was very, very common to be kidnapped into slavery and never to return home to see your parents, your loved ones again, every now and then something odd happened, something unexpected happened, and the system designed to kidnap you, traffic you, and enslave you didn't work perfectly, or the resistance and choices of the people it targeted were sufficient to produce a different outcome. And in my case, some of these 5 boys are able to make what I call in the subtitle an astonishing Odyssey home. Some of these 5 boys actually return to Philadelphia. I'm not going to say in what circumstances or how or why, but what I will tell you is when they get back to Philadelphia, they continue to blow the whistle about what happened to them. They give sworn testimony to the mayor of Philadelphia about their experience. And in this particular case, for very particular reasons, which are unusual, the mayor uses that information to see what he can do to try to launch a manhunt for some of these kidnappers and human traffickers. I think it's probably the largest manhunt in American history to that point, and it produces some significant results. And the boys, those that make it back, are able to pick up their lives to some degree where they left off. And one of the fun parts of this research was trying to follow these boys into adulthood to see how they did in the rest of their lives.
And, I think this whole story, this whole phenomenon of the reverse Underground Railroad, to me, it really speaks to the truth behind many of the militant or radical abolitionists' argument that the South was truly imperialistic in its support of slavery, that it would reach into all corners of the country and all parts of the world if it had to continue this system, up to and including, clearly snatching people off the street and importing them into a wholly different society and situation, contrary to all prevailing law in both sections. I mean, the imperiousness of the slave system is on full display here in this narrative.
I think that's right. I think that's a smart insight. And it's one I try to lean into in the book as well, because I think it's spot on. And it's something that people at the time in the North were discovering for themselves. Free Black people knew this acutely because their own liberty was at such acute risk from kidnappers who, if they could get across a state line into Delaware or Maryland, regarded themselves as being free and clear after that. And the chances of being followed and prosecuted and interfered with were relatively small in most cases. But one of the outcomes of this particular case and these 5 boys is that it does draw attention to the larger fragility of Black freedom in northern free cities and northern free states, and the great reach of what historians sometimes call the slave power into what we too quickly refer to as the free North. That freedom was wholly vulnerable, and anti-slavery activists, one of their prime goals in their various polemical propaganda print campaigns is to get white Northerners to realize just how many tentacles of the Southern slave power do reach across the border of the Mason-Dixon line and do penetrate the North and are ripping at the freedoms of free Black people down the street in cities like Philadelphia, in cities like New York, in cities as far north as Boston, even.
Our absolute greatest thanks to Professor Bell for joining us this week. So far on the show, I've made a habit of asking everyone what sort of work we need to do more of. Well, to my mind, here it is. Stolen is truly a powerful and humanistic book that challenges us to occupy these boys' experiences, however imperfect the exercise, and feel just how precarious freedom can be when both society and the state array themselves against us. Their struggles help show the way forward for each of us, and we want to thank Professor Bell for telling their story.